You keep replaying it, the deal that fell through, the relationship that ended before it should have, the door that slammed shut right when you thought it was finally opening. You did everything right or close enough, and it still fell apart. So here's the question you haven't let yourself ask out loud. What if that failure wasn't a mistake God allowed? What if it was the plan? Not the punishment, not the accident, the plan. That thought feels wrong at first. It feels like it lets God off the hook for something that hurt. But stay with it for a second, because Scripture tells this story over and over, and it never tells it the way you'd expect. Think about Joseph. In Genesis chapter 37, his own brothers throw him into a pit and sell him into slavery. Not a small setback, a total collapse of everything a 17-year-old thought his life was going to be. He goes from favored son to property overnight. Then it gets worse before it gets better. He's falsely accused, thrown in prison, forgotten by the one person who promised to remember him. Years pass, actual years, not a bad week. And nothing about that timeline looks like blessing. It looks like abandonment. But by the end of the story, Joseph is standing in front of the same brothers who sold him, and he says something that should stop you cold. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Read that again slowly. He doesn't say God fixed what they broke. He says God used the break itself. The pit, the slavery, the false accusation, the forgotten years in prison. All of it was doing something Joseph couldn't see while he was living through it. That's the part nobody warns you about. The purpose is rarely visible from inside the failure. It only makes sense looking backward. So let's bring this to where you actually live. Maybe it wasn't a pit. Maybe it was a job you didn't get, a marriage that ended, a dream that quietly died while you were busy trying to keep it alive. And somewhere in the middle of that failure, you probably asked the obvious question, why would God let this happen if He loved me? Here's a harder question underneath that one. What if the version of you that existed before the failure wasn't ready for the blessing that was coming? Consider Moses. Before he ever led a nation out of slavery, he failed spectacularly. He killed a man in anger, fled Egypt in disgrace, and spent 40 years herding sheep in the middle of nowhere. 40 years, not a gap year. A near lifetime of obscurity after a very public failure. And it was in that wilderness tending sheep he didn't even own that God met him at a burning bush. Exodus chapter 3, verse 10. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Notice the order. The failure came first. The wilderness came first. The blessing came after, and it came through a man who had already been humbled, already been stripped of the confidence that got him into trouble in the first place. God didn't bless the Moses who fled Egypt in pride. He blessed the Moses who had spent decades learning what he didn't know. Maybe your failure isn't proof that you're disqualified. Maybe it's the process that's qualifying you. That reframes everything about how you look at the setback you're still carrying. You've probably treated it like evidence. Evidence that you're not enough. Evidence that you missed your window. Evidence that God overlooked you while blessing people who never seemed to struggle the way you did. But what if failure isn't evidence against you? What if it's material God is still working with? Romans chapter 8, verse 28 gets quoted so often it's almost lost its weight, but read it slowly this time. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Not some things, all things. That includes the pit, that includes the 40 years, that includes whatever you're still grieving right now. This doesn't mean the failure didn't hurt. It doesn't mean it was fair or that the people who caused it were justified. Joseph's brothers were wrong. Moses' mistake had real consequences. Scripture never pretends otherwise, but it also never lets the failure have the final word. Here's what's easy to miss in both of those stories. Neither Joseph nor Moses got to skip the failure and go straight to the blessing. There was no shortcut version where Joseph stays the favored son and still ends up saving a nation. There was no version where Moses keeps his pride and still leads Israel out of Egypt with humility. The failure wasn't in spite of the blessing, it was underneath it, holding it up. So what does this mean for the failure sitting on your chest right now? It might mean the timeline you're grieving was never actually broken. It might mean you're standing in your own version of the pit, or your own 40 years in the wilderness, and you don't get to see the end of the story yet because you're still living inside the middle of it. That's the hardest part of faith, not believing God can redeem a failure after it's finished, believing He's already redeeming it while you're still in it, before you have any proof. Think about what that means practically. It means the job you didn't get might have been protecting you from a version of your life you weren't ready to carry. It means the relationship that ended might have been clearing space for a kind of love you couldn't have recognized while you were still attached to the wrong one. It means the dream that died might have needed to die so a truer one could take its place. None of that makes the grief smaller. Grief is still allowed. Joseph wept more than once in that story, even after everything worked out. Moses spent 40 years wondering if he'd wasted his life. You're allowed to feel the weight of what you lost while still trusting that it isn't the end of the account. Here's the shift worth making today. Stop asking why God let you fail, as if failure were the opposite of His plan. Start asking what the failure is preparing you to carry. Those are two completely different postures. One keeps you stuck looking backward at what broke. The other starts looking forward at what's being built. You don't need to understand the whole plan to trust that there is one. Joseph didn't understand it in the pit. Moses didn't understand it tending sheep in the wilderness. Understanding wasn't the requirement for the blessing to eventually come. Faithfulness in the waiting was. That word, faithfulness, gets misunderstood too. It doesn't mean forcing a smile through the pain or pretending the failure didn't cost you anything. Faithfulness in the waiting looked like Joseph still doing honest work in a prison cell he didn't deserve to be in. It looked like Moses still showing up to tend someone else's sheep, day after unremarkable day, with no indication anything would ever change. Neither of them felt like they were building something. They were just surviving the middle. But the middle was the training ground the whole time. That might be exactly where you are right now. Not failing, not being punished. Training in a season that doesn't look or feel like training at all. It just feels like loss. So if you're sitting in your own version of the pit right now, wondering if you missed your window, wondering if the failure was proof you weren't chosen, consider a different possibility. Maybe the pit isn't where the story ends. Maybe it's where the story that actually matters begins.
You keep replaying it, the failure you can't undo. Maybe that's not the tragedy you've been telling yourself it is. Maybe it's the chapter before the one you haven't read yet.